Godzilla is a franchise that really needs no introduction, and as someone who's a lifelong Godzilla fan, people could tell you that for a franchise that has as rich of a history as Godzilla, its merchandise, and more importantly its toys, also have somewhat of a history. Godzilla toys are one of the most unfortunate and fortunate things I have an unhealthy knowledge about. The Japanese company Bandai has always been at the forefront of the Godzilla collecting market, whether it be soft vinyls, SH Monster Arts, Gashapon capsule figures, Banpresto statues, you name it. It is undeniable that they are the mainstay for Godzilla collectors, but where exactly did it all start? That's what I'm going to be digging into today, as we look at the history of Bandai Godzilla toys in the 80s. Hey everyone, Epic Toxie here, and to commemorate reaching 1,000 subscribers, I thought I'd do this fun retrospective / overview of the Bandai Godzilla toys we all know and love. My friend Colorisa suggested that this should be broken up into decades, and I thought that was a pretty solid idea. So this video will go over the history of Bandai Godzilla toys in the 80s, the next in the 90s, and so on. Initially, I wanted to cover how these older Godzilla figures were made and distributed, but after digging a lot, I couldn't find much regarding how many of these older vintage figures were produced, or anything super specific regarding Bandai's manufacturing process. So instead, in today's video, I'm going to be going over every Bandai figure in detail and discuss some of the things about their value, maybe have some prototypes to show off, and some minor information about manufacturing and just the general history of these figures. Before we discuss the toys, I'd like to rewind a bit and revisit how Godzilla became associated with Bandai. According to an article on CollectorsWeekly.com, Godzilla was a big hit in the 1950s, but the only licensed product that came out in that time was a toy rifle produced in Japan for the 1955's Godzilla Raids Again. It wasn't until 1963 that American toy manufacturers started making their way into the Godzilla market. In the wake of the success of King Kong vs. Godzilla, Ideal Toy Corporation published a board game, which Aurora would follow with a Godzilla model kit. Marusan then developed a Godzilla figure made of vinyl, first sold in 1966, which would historically be the first Godzilla figure made out of vinyl. In 1970, Bullmark acquired Marusan's molds for the figures after they went bankrupt, and after making some unique toys, would also go bankrupt in 1978. Bandai was up next to be kaiju toy makers. They made toys under the Popey brand as a subdivision until 1983, after which the toys were marked with the Bandai brand. This now leads us into Bandai's first official line under their name, the Godzilla Collection. The Godzilla Collection spanned from 1983 to 1995, nearly starting from Godzilla 1984 to the final film of the Heisei series in Godzilla vs. Destroya. The figures in this line were mostly consistent with being in a 7 to 8 inch scale. I should clarify that I'm only going to be covering standard Bandai vinyls, so no finger puppets, no small little Shigukins, and none of the rubberized electronic figures. Yeah, I know that kinda means I'm lying in the title, but I do plan to do videos about more obscure sublines of Godzilla toys if you guys are interested. Finally, moving on to the toys, the first figure in the Godzilla Collection line was the original 1983 release of Godzilla 1962, from King Kong vs. Godzilla. It's important to mention that this figure was being released at the same time as the Ultra Collection. We'll talk about the convergence between those two lines later. King Goji, the name of this Godzilla suit, stands at around 9 inches tall from head to toe, and is approximately 11 inches from snout to tail, though his tail is curved off to the side. Unlike most Godzilla figures, he has articulation in the arms, oddly his shins, and his tail. No hip articulation. Most soft vinyl figures tend to have articulation because that's the way that they're molded, rather than intentional pieces of articulation, at least in some of these older figures. The figure is in this greenish color, likely because of the movie's poor preservation, meaning most people perceive the suit to be green, and it's also a typical color for Godzilla. In terms of paint, he sports silver highlights for his spines, nails, and chest. My copy doesn't have the silver on the nails because I got this at G-Fest unaware of the fact that someone repainted it, so don't mind that. The sculpting of the figure was supervised by Mr. Masao Inoue. Inoue's resin kits of the 1962 Godzilla under his brand, Inoue Arts, show some pretty heavy influence on the Bandai vinyl sculpt, particularly in its proportions and the pose. The tag seems to suggest that the prototype for this sculpt was done by legendary sculptor Hayami Hitoshi, who is responsible for many prototypes used for Bandai vinyl figures and model kits. Mr. Hayami and Mr. Inoue's influence over Godzilla kits was truly historic. Mr. Hayami's garage kit of King Goji seemed to serve as the prototype for this figure, released by Kyoto. Before I continue with this figure, I want to mention how Bandai's manufacturing process works. Thanks to Goji Guy, not to be confused with that other Goji guy, who helped me add some extra information regarding these prototypes. The process usually starts with a wax or clay sculpted figure being made, then they make a master mold of that initial sculpt, and after that, they make test shots in different colors, then make test shots in the main color the figure will be in, then make highly detailed painted early versions, and finally, mass production of the final figure. I also attended a panel at G-Fest this year where Maru-san, one of the founding fathers of Godzilla Sofubi, explained their processes for making molds and the creative process that goes into making a figure. They start with sketching a concept for the figure, sculpting the figure out of a block of foam, cutting around it to make a shape, and eventually adding details with clay. The figure is hand sculpted, so the symmetry of the figure has to be replicated by hand. The figure then has molds produced, which essentially look like giant metal pans, where only a certain number of units can be produced with that particular master mold before it breaks. Back to Godzilla, the sculpt is pretty serviceable and impressive for the time, and also considering that this is Bandai's quote-unquote first ever toy. I wouldn't say that this figure is very suit accurate. It captures the silhouette well, but the facial features are off, the pose is quite awkward, and the small eyes make the figure look somewhat doofy. If you're a stickler for accuracy, then this probably isn't your cup of tea, but then again, if that's your taste, Bandai vinyls probably aren't for you anyway. His face just looks off in some kind of way, but it's still charming. The tail is curved, which can allow for easier display, but it's also relatively thin and short. Obviously, I'd like to mention that all these figures were intended for kids at the time, not for adult collectors. So all these minute details I'm pointing out are not actual critical criticisms, just simply me pointing out the small inaccuracies and eventual improvement in Bandai's sculpts. Most typical Bandai releases came with a tag. People consider these like a trading card or just a collector-specific thing, but bottom line, they're included. The original tag for this figure came detached, and I just want to say that I think these original Bandai tags are super cool. Love the look of these things, and I think they really reflect the time in which they were made. These tags differentiated the original Godzilla Collection figures as the plastic tag figures by collectors back in the day. The tags themselves are either laminated or made of plastic. Refer to them however you wish. Godzilla 1962 actually came in a plastic bag alongside its original tag and an informational card with similar information that's on the tag. Oddly, the tag is an image of the 1964 Godzilla rather than, you know, the correct suit on the back, which is an interesting choice from Bandai. As we go later on in the series, you'll see that this is kind of a recurring thing. Don't know why they continue to do this, but it's a pattern. Unlike most Godzilla figures that you'll see later in the line, this figure was one of the first, if not the only, to come with the tag, but it's not a hang tag. Overall, I'd say that this figure hasn't aged very well, but it's quite impressive for what it is, and a perfectly fine start to the line. When this figure was first released back in 1983, it ran for 1,800 yen, which was about $7.35 back in 83, but nowadays, being adjusted for inflation, it would cost about $22.50 in 2023. The calculator I used only had 2023, sorry. But yeah, just thought that was pretty neat. The figure was also released in early November, likely to coincide with Godzilla's birthday. Also, apparently, man, I wonder where I'm getting all this cool information from. At some point in the figure's production, they intended to have a sales method that allows you to choose whether or not you wanted King Goji molded in black, green, or gray vinyl, which never ended up in production, but we'll see the influence of this fact in later releases. The next figure that would be released also came out in November of 1983, Wikizilla is wrong, was Godzilla 1964. The original Bandai Godzilla Collection 1964 is a pretty funny looking figure, all things considered. Despite his goofy look, I don't think this is a bad looking figure, although the pose might be a bit off-putting to most people, maybe a little awkward, but it looks more like 64 than 62 did to its respective suit, in my opinion. The sculpt of this figure was also supervised by Mr. Inoue and seems to be based on a 50 centimeter long resin kit done by Mr. Inoue. Here, the resemblance to the kit is a bit looser than 62, but when I cover Mechagodzilla, you'll see the influence of Inoue's work on the sculpts of these figures. Back to the actual sculpt, his arms look quite stubby, but honestly, the rest of the sculpt looks great and has aged decently well in my opinion. One gripe I do have is that this figure's spines have bits of vinyl still molded in the spaces between them, which makes them look blocky and kind of weird. That's really the only qualm I have with this figure. The original 1983 release of this figure is molded in a greenish vinyl, much darker than 62, but similarly, it has the same silver highlights. Unlike the 62, the tail on 64 is long and big and thick. The toy is about 8 inches tall, being about an inch shorter than the 62. I'm comparing these two directly a lot because I want to emphasize the improvements you can see just between these two releases from Bandai. Another improvement is the articulation. He has movement in the legs and the tail. The tag itself looks nice, just like the last one, but oddly it's attached to the back above the hip. The tag on this guy and for all the other 83 and 84 vinyls have a triangular tag barb, different from the traditional eye loop one that we're very all familiar with. Unlike the King Ghidorah, who just didn't have the tag attached at all, the tag also, oddly, like the 62 tag, has the incorrect Godzilla, this one having the 1967 Godzilla for some whatever reason. The number here also reflects that of Pigmon's number, 32, in the Kingsaurus series. Again, kind of odd that they overlap. I guess this collaboration between the lines wasn't terribly well thought out. The tag for this guy is also made of plastic, like the 62. Overall, a lot of improvements, but the goofy pose does detract from a lot of it. As for the value, the original price of this figure was about 950 yen, which is about $3.88 back in 83. Nowadays, as in 2023, that's $11.38. Another cool fun fact about this figure is that it appears, or at least one of its variants, in 1991's Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah in the scene where Terasawa gets a call from the security agency.
Our friend Mr. Shindo should have seen the dinosaur as well.
Next up in the Godzilla collection from 1983 is my friend Victor. Why do I call him that? I actually don't know. The first Bandai Mechagodzilla figure is a representation of the original 1974 design for Mechagodzilla from the Showa era, not 1975, which, yes, there are actual differences between those suits. The sculpt of this figure is quite solid, although it definitely looks old and has that very upright, almost totem-like look of these vintage figures, like the Bullmark sculpts, like these older Bandai sculpts. A reason why this Mechagodzilla figure looks the way it does can be attributed once again to the great Masao Inoue. He would sculpt both a 1974 Mechagodzilla as a garage kit for his brand, as well as a 1975 Mechagodzilla, which were released in 1983 and 1984 respectively. And when looking at these sculpts, the resemblance is undeniable, and really cool in my opinion, considering that we didn't have a Mechagodzilla 1975 vinyl from Bandai all the way until 2002 with the first release of the movie Monster Series figure. So in a way, this is a view into what that figure could have potentially looked like, obviously ignoring the fact that the Mechagodzilla 2 kit came out after the original release of the Bandai vinyl. Both of these kits, by the way, look fantastic and are really cool pieces of history by being tied to this sculpt. Speaking of the actual sculpt, the detail is quite impressive. Everything you want is there, the bolts, all the panels, the MG logo, the closed mouth including all the teeth. It all looks solid. The pose again is quite awkward with the arms being straight. I imagine that has something to do with the limitations of Sofubi production at the time, considering how the garage kits from Inoue Arts are slightly different in terms of the depth to the overall detail. One key difference between this original release and its later reissues is the indent on the inside of the booster on his tail. The other releases have these rounded nubs on the inside, while this original plastic tag release is just completely flat. There are a plethora of differences between this original release and later ones that are quite intriguing, as we'll get into later. As for the rest of the figure, the paint job is quite nice, with the eyes, teeth, and ear caps all being painted properly, along with some nice black highlights to accentuate the figure. Important to mention that this figure's eyes and teeth were more of a copper color, and that the later reissues of Mechagodzilla would be more of a gold color with lighter highlights. I should mention that when I refer to reissues, there are actually several kinds of reissues in the Godzilla collection that I wasn't aware of until very recently. These original couple of figures from the Godzilla collection were actually reissued as they are, with some minor paint and molding variations throughout the years. This can be said for most of the figures in the line, but I'll mention it here as when we talk about the later releases of Mechagodzilla, there is a whole lot more to them, apart from simple re-releases of the original figure. So these original plastic tag figures were actually re-released up until the production shifted to the definitive reissues that would sport different tags, but again, we'll get to that. The plastic tag is attached to the back and looks pretty nice overall, being similar to the 64 tag, but with an image of Mechagodzilla on the back instead of Godzilla 1967. Here you can also see that these tags are also labeled on the back, back, with Godzilla 64 sporting 32 and Mechagodzilla 33. These numbers represent what figures they are from Bandai as a whole, not just the Godzilla collection. The numbers of these figures from the Godzilla collection were supposed to include Bandai's Ultraman toys as well. However, since some of those numbers repeat, like both 84 and King Ghidorah being listed as 47, and like I mentioned earlier, it kind of implies that this direction wasn't really clear. Now, back to the figure. Unlike the other figures so far, Mechagodzilla can move his head in addition to both his arms and legs, but he lacks a tail swivel, unlike the last two figures. Overall, this figure is interesting, and I love the ties to the kits from Mr. Inoue, but the figure itself is a bit boring, and the original sculpt does leave a little to be desired. I mean, Victor he just kind of looks stupid. I mean, look at it. The original price of this figure was the same as Godzilla 1964, being about 950 yen, which was about $3.88 back in 84. Nowadays, as in 2023, that's $11.38. This figure actually still has some relatively recent test shots floating around, as Goji Guy actually owns one of them, and it's in this really slick black vinyl. Here's a prototype in a bluer vinyl. The craziest prototype I've seen in all of my research while making this video is this one. This incredible MG in glittery, translucent, rosy pink vinyl. This comes from a Japanese collector who won this in an auction, and I've heard since from other sources that this apparently was sold or given away at some sort of local event in Japan. This thing is just so cool, and the origins of it potentially are tied to the reissues that I'll talk about in just a moment. Next up is Bandai's first and technically only 6-inch scale figure in the Godzilla collection, the 1984 Godzilla from Godzilla 1984, or The Return of Godzilla, or Godzilla 1985. This figure came out in what I assume to be the early winter or summer of 1984. Funny story surrounding this figure, at G-Fest this year, as I'm recording this in 2026, I saw one of these in a case in the dealer's room, and since I've been working on this video for the past 2 years, I was pretty intrigued by it, so I asked the table about it, and they basically tried selling me on it, and they labeled it as the first Bandai figure ever. Yeah, so not to be a bit of a nerd, but that's wrong. Now, you know what else is wrong? I want you to take a look at this figure and guess what design it's based on. Is it the suit used in the movie, or is it the Cybot animatronic that was also used in the film, but also heavily prevalent in the marketing? Well, if you said the Cybot, you're wrong. And that's because this figure was based on neither. This figure was once again sculpted by Mr. Hayami, and he actually details in the Great Godzilla Encyclopedia that the prototype and the sculpt of this toy would be based on a maquette which was using a concept design, different to that of the final suit used in the film, or even the Cybot animatronic. He states in the book, the base of this figure prototype is the model maquette on the right. When I was asked to make it, neither the Cybot nor the costume had been made, so I was sent this photo of this template as material. A characteristic feature of the model is that the tail is weak. If I were to judge it based on this design, I'd say it captures this look perfectly well. Although, if I were to nitpick, I would say that the head could be a little rougher, but that might be due to the limitations of Sofubi making at the time. These really intricate scales and deep grooves are not really common on any of these earlier figures. So, for the people who criticize this figure for not looking like the 84 suit that we all know and love, be fair and compare to this maquette design and not the suit that was used in the movie. One improvement regarding detail on this figure is that it seems to just have a more consistent look to the skin texture, unlike the last two Godzillas, which tend to look somewhat soft in areas, like the toes on Godzilla 1962. As for the tag, which looks quite awesome and is also the inspiration for the thumbnail of this video, it displays images of the Cybot Godzilla. He has typical silver highlights we've come to expect on these older Godzillas, being on the spines, chest, feet, and hands. Godzilla's teeth are painted well, with some overspray being visible, and a vibrant red tongue. The articulation of this figure is quite standard, having the same movement as 64, being in the arms, legs, and tail. The tag is also the first to be made out of the traditional papery cardboard material, rather than the plastic that has been used for the other figures. One aspect of this figure that was actually entirely unique to it for another 14 years was its scale, as I mentioned when introducing this figure. The original Bandai Godzilla 1984 was inexplicably a 6-inch tall figure, unlike all of his peers who were all in the 7 to 9-inch scale. Another cool fact about this figure is that the production quantity of this figure was actually smaller than planned due to the original mold breaking, and I believe that also this figure doesn't have any of those following sort of sub reissues issues like I talked about with Mechagodzilla, so that's why this figure is seemingly less common than the other plastic tag figures. This figure was also likely to be the inspiration for the design of the very infamous original Imperial 1984 Godzilla toy. The MSRP of this figure was 500 yen, which in 84 was about $2. In modern day, that would be about $5.90. This figure also still has a surviving prototype, and it's in the hands of the real Vinyl Madness, who was kind enough to share some photos of it for this video, and it looks really cool. I mean, it's as cool as a test shot can get, but I mean, it's cool that it exists. To wrap it up, I just think that this figure is so interesting, and probably one of my favorites, probably my favorite Godzilla potentially of the original 5, just because it's so cool that this is based on the concept maquette design, not even the Cybot. It's based on a maquette design for the Godzilla 1984 suit, and I just think that is so incredibly cool, and it just makes me really appreciate this figure all that much more. And for a little bit of trivia, this is actually only one of 3 concept art based Godzilla figures from Bandai, at least in sort of the normal vinyl scale. That being this 1984 Godzilla, Bag-In, and the obviously maquette Godzilla 1954, 2 of which were all recent figures. It took them almost like 40 years or so to make another concept art based Godzilla figure, which I think is just really cool. So yeah, let's get on to the last of the original 5. Finally, the most elusive and last figure released in the summer of 84 is the original Bandai King Ghidorah. The reason this figure was made was actually because of fan demand. Apparently, King Ghidorah was so highly demanded because it wasn't initially planned like how the previous 4 figures were. So after a certain subline, which included a King Ghidorah figure, a standard one was made for the Godzilla Collection. This is by far the best and technically the largest figure so far, standing about 9 inches tall with a 9.5-inch wingspan. The sculpt of this figure is by far the best and the most accurate of any of the figures we've covered so far, at least in my opinion. It is a very simple, smooth, uniform, and relatively accurate sculpt. It definitely has the older look, but for me and a lot of other collectors, this figure never really looks out of place, even with more modern vinyls. It's just that good and really iconic and has just, stood the test of time. This sculpt, unlike the previous figures, doesn't seem to have a reference or heavy inspiration for the design. If I were to nitpick the sculpt a bit, I would say that it does look somewhat thin around the legs, and certain parts of the figure do look soft, like the horns, the end of the wings and tails, but this is due to this being a toy at the end of the day, so they can't have super sharp edges. In my opinion, the sculpt is near perfect. The paint job is definitely what gives this figure sort of a goofy look. It has white eyes, which make the figure look pretty funny. If they were orange or red like the Kaiju Bangachi figure many years later, or even the newer movie Monster Series release, I think they'd look fine, but this is likely because of King Ghidorah's most recent appearance being in Godzilla vs. Gigan at the time of this figure's release, where his eyes were indeed white, which is probably the case as the tag actually uses images of the 1972 Ghidorah. But I think just from the general vibe of this figure, it is very clearly one of the earlier iterations of the Showa Ghidorah suit, whether it be 64 or the 68 incarnation. Considering the more upright horns and also generally upright posture of this figure, and I don't think anyone who has ever owned this figure has seriously considered this to be the 1972 King Ghidorah. This is the first figure that we're going to be covering that has multiple versions within the same release year. The original release has a very heavy greenish gold color with some black highlights, along with the mouths being fully painted red with the teeth being a nice silver color, and the necks have this brown spray highlight on top. Now, there is a different variant of this original 84 release for Ghidorah. It is typically referred to as the dull gold version. This version of the figure has way less paint to cut on production costs, so it's more similar to later releases of this figure. It sports a slightly yellower gold color and is still painted pretty prominently. This release also only has the tongues painted rather than the entire mouth. The black and brown highlights that are quite heavy on the initial version are a bit lighter and less vivid on the duller gold release. One way to immediately tell these 2 original releases of King Ghidorah apart from any of the reissues is the eyes. These 2 84 releases have these full bulbous pupils that sit closer to the center of the 3-headed Hydra's eyes, unlike later releases which would have this eyeliner shape that would sit at the top of the eye. But with all that out of the way, in terms of articulation, the figure has swivels at the base of the necks, wings, legs, and at the base of the tail. For this guy's tag, it's similar to the 1962 Godzilla, where it was never originally attached to the figure. It was released inside a plastic bag along with the tag. This was consistent with both releases of the figure. So all the images you see of this original 1984 Ghidorah with an attached tag have been reattached secondhand. I have heard that within the bag, the tag was at least kept on the figure through a rubber band, but I have no idea if this information is true or not, and it's essentially just a rumor among collectors that's been circulating for the past like 30 years. For the tag itself, I love the plastic tags for these vintage figures. Again, the tag itself is entirely brand new, not reusing the 64 tag like Mechagodzilla. It is these cool starbursty orange graphics like the 84 Godzilla with an image of the 1972 Ghidorah, as I mentioned earlier. And on the back, we see again that it is indeed the 1972 Ghidorah, as he is right next to Gigan. Oddly enough, both this and the 1984 Godzilla have 47 as their collection number. So I guess both of these came out literally at the same time, or at least were intended to. There is a sick prototype test shot of this figure out there, which is in this really cool bright blue color. Another interesting thing is that there are multiple bootlegs of this figure. Obviously, these don't come with tags, but interestingly, they are in different colors. Here are two pink and green ones from Uncrazymatic, and this blue one from someone on the Toho Kingdom forums. I'm not sure if there's one in gold, but I'd imagine it would say that it's made in China on the foot if there were. I've never seen any of these vintage bootlegs for sale, so I wouldn't really worry a lot if you're trying to get this original release. I find this figure to be super nostalgic, and it's a great figure on top of that, and has aged quite well. The original price of this figure was 1,500 yen, which was about $6.10 in 1984. Now it would cost you about $17.89. Pretty interesting that this figure was originally cheaper than the King Goji toy, which I guess is made up of both Ghidorah being technically smaller in terms of vinyl mass and just economic shifts in Japan's between years. According to an article in Uchusen Volume 20, this soft vinyl figure is introduced as a cheaper version of the large soft vinyl King Ghidorah limited edition, which is a part of the Great Monster series, which I'll go over soon. Finally, we wrapped up the original 5 from 83 and 84, and now I can finally talk about all the damn reissues. Wait. Before I get to the boring reissues I've been referring to all video, I have to talk about something, well, bigger. The Bandai Great Monster series. These figures also came out in 1984 for the 30th anniversary of Godzilla. These figures are very large, as suggested by the name. Well, I'm pretty sure technically the entire Godzilla Collection line falls under the Great Monster series, but I'm not super sure. The line included Mosugoji, Godzilla 1964, Mothra Larva, and King Ghidorah. Starting with Godzilla, this figure is also known as the Bandai Limited Edition Godzilla, which, if you were to Google that, the name does not narrow it down whatsoever. The original 1964 Godzilla stands almost 8 inches tall and looks great. Obviously a vast improvement on the initial The Godzilla Collection release. The detail and the paint job on this figure are pretty nice. Even so, however, the eyes are a bit buggy looking and the head itself does look small, but the overall figure really has a presence and looks great. The paint is solid as well, as the spines and chest are highlighted with a clean silver. The reissue does seem to go much heavier and brighter with the silver. The original release has a fully painted mouth compared to the 88 reissue, which seems to have just the tongue. The 84 release has a more bone-like color for the claws, while the reissue appears much grayer. This first release also looks like less bug-eyed than the reissue. Ugh. The original release is also bigger and a bit better proportioned, as the reissue has more of an hourglass shape, while the original just looks way more natural. The sculpt of this figure again is inspired by the Inoue Arts kit we talked about when looking at the Godzilla Collection Mosugoji. The sculpt of this original release greatly reflects this inspiration, and both the kit and this figure look great. I think this figure obviously follows the Godzilla Collection inspiration much heavier, and I believe these pictures of this sculpt on screen were released following the original Great Monster Series 64. I thought I'd show this off because it looks absolutely incredible. This big lug can move his arms and legs if you really want to, and the base of his tail is all on the standard Bandai vinyl lip swivel. One thing I should probably mention is what I mean by vinyl or Bandai lip. When a vinyl figure is assembled, it needs inserts that allow for the piece to actually stay in place. So usually these pieces are circular or just fit into the socket however they need to, and fan out a bit to keep the piece from slipping out. I'm pretty sure literally every Bandai vinyl has a vinyl lip. Even the ones without articulation usually still have glue seams, meaning that they have a vinyl lip. I just call them vinyl lips. Well, I guess I don't really know. I guess they just kind of look like lips. I just came up with that name. I'll stop saying lip. The 84 release came in a pretty plain looking box with Godzilla's name in blue, along with limited edition being printed in the top corner. The 88 release comes in an entirely different box that has a lot more going on, with a label of King of the Monsters and the 1984 Godzilla on the front. Unlike the standard vinyls, the 88 reissue and the original 84 release do have different text on the feet to tell them apart if you're looking for a specific version, if the differences I pointed out were not enough. I will say that if you have the choice between either of these, pick the original. It is much better in my opinion. I think it completely outclasses the reissue. The last fun fact about this figure is that it appears in a 1991 Ishiro Honda interview, sitting on the table next to him. You can also find this part of the interview on YouTube. This is one of my personal favorite releases by Bandai ever, specifically the 84 one, and for a lot of collectors this is a grail piece. A great figure to start this subline. Moving on to the next figure, the limited bronze 1964 Godzilla. This is probably one of the most elusive Bandai figures ever made regarding typical mainline releases. All three of the original Great Monster Series figures are limited, but for this bronze Mosugoji, only 1,000 pieces were initially made in 1984. 100 of those were imported by Bandai directly to the US. It's also important to note that the box for the bronze 64 is different from the standard release. The text on the left-hand side of the box reads bronze type. This repaint also would come out in 1984, so it utilizes the original sculpt of the Mosugoji, I believe. Last thing to mention about all these Great Monster Series Mosugojis is that there are bootlegs of all of them. Although it is really easy to tell the differences, as they'll be different in paint, detail quality, and the shape and size of the spines. So watch out if you want to pick any of these up. That includes the limited bronze release, which is probably the most notoriously bootleg to trick collectors. Unfortunately, I don't know the retail prices for any of these releases, so let's move on. Next we have another original Great Monster Series figure, Mothra Larva. This figure is about 12 inches long and comes in a plastic bag inside a pretty cool retro looking box. The box also sort of indicates that this is the 1961 Mothra Larva, but I guess it's not that important. This poop came out in May of 1984, and overall is a pretty nice looking figure. This guy would later be reissued without the box in 1991 in the Godzilla Collection with a tag instead of a box. Besides that, it's a nice looking figure. One interesting thing about this figure is that it's soft vinyl. All the figures so far and all the figures in this video are made of hard vinyl, so this is a nice change of pace. So one of my favorite things to do with these figures when I was younger, and when you would hear them in videos, is when they would be reviewed on a hard surface and you would hear them go. You just bring it up and then it just makes a nice smack sound. According to a magazine article from the time, this figure was based on a garage kit that was sculpted by Mr. Hayami and released by Kyoto. The kit is another case of the figure basically being a spitting image of it. I mean, it's a Mothra Larva, not much else to say really. I do like the paint though, some nice shades of black and brown with a nice lighter brown to highlight some of the parts of the figure, along with some bright red eyes to help the figure stand out. No articulation on this thing, so it's quite the brick, but it does have a seam in the middle. I don't know if it's just a glue seal or actual articulation. The original release definitely has it as a glue seal though. Overall, this figure's nice, nothing too special about it, but I mean, who wouldn't want a 12-inch long Mothra Larva in their collection, right? The original price in 1984 was $8.16. In present day, it would be about $23.90. We'll eventually talk about the subsequent reissues of this sculpt in a different video. One last thing to mention is that I'm pretty sure this figure is in scale with the Mothra Larvas from the 1964 movie with the Great Monster Series Godzilla, which is really cool. I think that's a cool touch because the Mothra Larvas in that movie are extremely tiny, so I think it's pretty cool that they scale with the bigger figure. Overall, I like this figure, but I mean, I guess there isn't a whole lot to dislike, unless you don't like poop. Last but not least is the Great Monster Series King Ghidorah, otherwise known within the Godzilla collecting space as the Fragile Wing Ghidorah, which came out in the spring of '84. I'm sure you can imagine why it's been given this infamous title. The figure gained the Fragile Wing name from the fact that the wings on this figure are very susceptible to breakage because of how they connect to the body. The wings are attached by inserting a thin tab into slots on the back of the figure. This is also explained in the included instructions. The problem comes in the fact that the wings have some weight to them, causing those tabs to break off at the base base if put into the figure. This is pretty similar to the infamous original X plus 25cm 1968 Ghidorah, which was notoriously one of the most problematic X plus releases of the time. Most collectors display the wings of the fragile wing King Ghidorah behind the figure for effect without actually inserting the wings. I'm sure with more modern ingenuity, you could create stands that would hold them in place while having them attached, but I guess we wouldn't know until someone actually tries it. I mentioned before that this figure potentially might have been the catalyst for why they made a Godzilla Collection King Ghidorah, and again, these release dates that I'm mentioning for these figures might not be 100% accurate, so take it with a grain of salt. The figure itself is nice, but honestly, the sculpt to me isn't super impressive, at least when considering how the Great Monster Series Mosugoji is a real upgrade detail-wise compared to its Godzilla Collection counterpart, whereas with Ghidorah, it seems pretty comparable to its respective figure. I think the poses of the necks are a little static and too close together, at least when considering how erratic and jittery the original King Ghidorah was. The figure also isn't really gold, it's more so just an odd creamy yellow color. The wings themselves also aren't super impressive. They don't actually have any spikes on the ends of the wings like the actual suit does, which is odd. The only points of articulation here are the legs and the base of the tail. Nothing at the heads, unlike the standard vinyl. Ghidorah also comes in a big box like all the other Great Monster Series figures, which is pretty similar to the 64 box, just with Ghidorah's name, the limited edition subtitle, and some information regarding some Bandai contact information for customers. Not a huge fan of this figure. It's a cool novelty, but its fragility, along with its rarity, kind of turns me off from this figure. In my opinion, it is somehow a downgrade to the original Godzilla Collection figure despite the larger scale. But like all of these older figures, I still think it's cool and interesting, just kind of funny how it's a standalone figure that doesn't even really scale with anything. It most certainly does not scale with the Mosugoji, that's for sure. In 1984, he initially costed 10,000 yen, which in 1984 was about $40.50, and in 2023, it would be about $118.80. As I mentioned in the standard Ghidorah segment, because the demand for a King Ghidorah was so high due to this figure, the original standard one was made. So it seems like the original 83 figures came, and then before the other 3 of the original 5, the Great Monster Series figures were released. At least that's what seems to be somewhat implied from this information that I've gathered throughout making this video. Finally, I can move on from 84, just give me a second for some water. So Bandai didn't actually release any true new figures until 1988 when they reissued both Mosugoji and King Ghidorah. What I mean by true reissues is that there are official release changes between figures. Most of the original 5 figures were actually reissued throughout the decade, but they were the same as the initial release, while having some minor production changes that made them distinguishable from original releases. For example, the only Mosugoji to be molded in green vinyl was the original 83 release. However, the original was reissued until the main release in 88. These releases aren't very apparent, but some are easier to tell as the paint actually matches the 88 releases. The main differences between these 88 versions and the original releases are the tags. In fact, both the Godzilla and King Ghidorah were called the alternate tag Godzilla and Ghidorah, among collectors for having very unique tags. The 88 release of 64 Godzilla has the tag attached closer to the head, and the tag itself is different, now being made with the more familiar, papery, cardboard-like material. The tags are also now attached by the traditional eye-loop tag barb. The paint differences with 64 are the black sprays across the body over the dark green vinyl, along with heavier and more abundant silver sprays on the lower body. So when I mention the weird amalgamated plastic tag Mosugoji releases, I'm referring to the ones that have this separated silver spray on the legs, where it's one spot on the knees and the rest of it on the foot, while the original will have minimal spray on the chest and the entire lower leg will be sprayed collectively. ClubTokyo.org actually has this variant of the plastic tag 64 with the isolated spray on the legs. With King Ghidorah, the differences are less noticeable, but there are still 2 versions of this figure, where one is similar to the brighter gold of the original, where the entire figure is painted the same brighter gold as the 84 release, and the other has less paint with stronger black highlights. The latter was a method of saving production costs by using less paint, as I mentioned before with the previous releases. Also, like earlier, the little eyeliner is now present on this release and would be shared by every following release of this sculpt. One last difference is that on both releases, only the tongues are painted red. The all gold Ghidorah has the tag attached by the side of the chest, and the orangey Ghidorah has the tag attached by the base of the necks on the back. Again, the tags are the most noticeable change. You can see the slow evolution of the tag changing into the more modern style as we get to the 90s figures. I already talked about the Great Monster Series reissue of 64, so that wraps up 1988. Moving on to 1989, the final year I'll be covering in this video. There's even more reissues in this wave of figures where Bandai decided to reissue King Ghidorah and Godzilla 1964 again, but they also did a proper re-release of Victor. The big differences here again are the tags, where they display an image from Destroy All Monsters. There are some subtle differences in the paint. King Ghidorah sports a lighter gold. The brown/black highlights all over the body seem to be more concentrated on this release. This release is known to look identical to the 1988 dull painted King Ghidorah and is nearly impossible to distinguish without a tag. Without it, you can tell based on where the actual tag hole is. The 88 release will have the hole closer to the base of the necks on the back, while the 89 release has it closer to the center of the back. The main difference for the 64 Godzilla is the really generous silver spray on the lower body, very oversprayed here for whatever reason. The 1989 release of King Ghidorah with the tag is nearly impossible to find. It is probably one of the rarest, if not the rarest, standard Bandai vinyl ever issued, and so few have ever been known to exist with the tag attached. I actually have the supposed 1989 King Ghidorah release based on the differences I've listed. If only I had the tag. For Mechagodzilla's 1989 release, there's a lot to talk about. So I did mention during the segment that the following releases of Mechagodzilla have the rounded nub inside the booster on the end of his tail, which is present on the Damn Tag release. But also a really interesting thing about this figure is that some of the limbs are multicolored with silver painted on top. Remember that pretty pink glitter test shot I showed earlier? Well, the collector who posted that also has a Mechagodzilla with a yellow head and arms. This was apparently another result of Bandai wanting to cut on production costs, but this was also present throughout other releases from 1989, not just Mechagodzilla. This mixed and match molding for Mechagodzilla wasn't always present, and some of these 89 releases don't feature this crazy stuff, but from what I understand, this was a rare early production run from when these figures were initially released. For more visible differences on the actual figure, Victor has gold eyes, only has paint for the front of the teeth compared to the copper of the plastic tag version, and the black highlights seem to be way more concentrated compared to the original 83 release. Well, one thing I want to mention is that I don't know why they ever painted Mechagodzilla's teeth, because I mean his teeth are like silver or like clear. They're definitely not gold or copper, so I mean I guess they just wanted to do that. Victor is also apparently slightly smaller than the original release, as you can see through some of these photos. Okay, so moving on to the new figures. First up is Minya. Minya is pretty cool. Oddly, a lot of people really don't like Minya, and I don't know why, to be honest. I mean, he's okay, I get that he's ugly, but he's just this silly, stupid, cute little son of Godzilla.
Say that again?
I mean, I get it. He's ugly and a bit unsettling, and he's been dubbed over really weird, and you know, many people think he's a stain on the franchise. The figure itself is pretty nice and resembles him decently. Obviously not up to snuff for modern figures, but hey, this was the only representation of Showa Minya we had for about 30 years from Bandai. This figure isn't really all that accurate, but it's passable in my opinion. Compared to the new Movie Monster Series Godzilla Store exclusive Minya, or even the original YMSF Minya, it's really outclassed. Not the second YMSF Minya though. Detail-wise, his what are supposed to be warts are more like pores instead of like pimples, and I don't know, it makes me kind of uncomfortable. His limbs are somewhat stubby and just kind of look fatter than they should be. The paint is nice and relatively matte, which contrasts with nearly every other vinyl in the line. Ironically, besides the first two releases of both Mosu Goji and King Goji. Interestingly, Minya has some really subtle red and black highlights on some parts of his body. His eyes, mouth, and teeth are painted cleanly, but he is missing his bottom row of teeth, which makes him look kind of like a vampire. Minya has articulation at the arms and legs. Minya stands at about 5 inches tall. If you're looking for the original release, make sure to read the text on the tag and confirm that it says 1989 and not 1992. But there is actually more to this. Apparently, the 1989 releases have these number codes on the back sides of the tag, which signify what year the figure was actually released, regardless of what the perforated section of the tag reads. The final digit being a 2 indicates that it was released in 92 if the tag reads it was released in 89. I believe this also occurs for the 1992 reissues as well. The original price of this figure in 89 was 600 yen, which is $4.10, and in 2023, Little Minya would cost about $10. This figure also has a bootleg, which is very noticeably different as the paint quality is much worse and the figure has an incredibly glossy finish, which is unlike the official figure. Moving on to another kind of boring figure, just getting these out of the way first. 1964 Mothra Larva. I actually own this one. Well, I actually own two, one with the tag and one without. Apparently this figure has two variants from this year, one that sports a way darker brown vinyl and the other with a lighter one. Oddly, nothing else is really different, so I guess this wasn't intentional and was likely another instance of cost cutting for the sake of larger production quantities. The figure is nicely sculpted, resembling the original puppet well. It has an open mouth and has nice texturing throughout. There's articulation at the base of the head portion, and that's basically it, obviously. Mothra's around 6.5 inches long, and the paint job is very nice. Mothra has some light brown highlights on her face and across the back. There's also a reddish color to highlight the legs or hair. I can't really tell which one it's supposed to be. And her eyes are a nice bright metallic blue. This is another one of those figures, as I mentioned earlier, that were reissued in 1992 but still had the 89 print on the tag for some of the early publications, which is actually one of the ones that I have. The code on my Mothra Larva ends with a 2, meaning that it is an early release of the 1992 Mothra, despite 89 being written at the bottom of the tag. This is a completely serviceable figure, and that's what every Mothra Larva is going to be 99% of the time, so yeah, I quite like it. Next is the 1956 Rodan. This figure honestly isn't my favorite. I think it's inferior to basically 90% of all Showa Rodan figures that exist, but it's still a nice figure despite me saying that. This sculpt is nice with a lot of detail. However, I do feel that this is another sculpt that is quite outdated. The wingspan, and more specifically the space between the neck and the hands, feels quite short. I would have liked to see Rodan have slightly wider wings. Again, a bit of a nitpick, but I figured it's important to point out all of the small details on these figures, so forgive me if that bothers you in any way. There's nice texturing on this figure, and overall, even though the details on the wings are somewhat smooth, the sculpt has aged somewhat well. The paint job on this figure, however, is really odd, having gold highlights for the nails, chest, and beak, and this weird green on the back of the figure for seemingly no reason. Strangely enough, the Playmates 1956 Rodan actually copied this paint scheme, including the weird green bit, and I think the reason why they included the green is because it's on one of the flying Rodan props, but it's 100% not on the suit, so I'm not really sure why they did that. Rodan stands at about 7 inches tall. This was another one of the 1989 releases that had a really small run of mismatched colored limbs. Some of these were just early sales that weren't supposed to necessarily be proper stock releases. Rodan's releases throughout the years would also have a slight sculpt change in an odd spot, under the feet. As the Godzilla collection continued, many Rodans had issues standing, as unlike most other monsters in the line, Rodan doesn't have a long enough tail to have 3 points of connection to the ground. So to circumvent this, later releases would have these bumps that would be larger on later reissues to help the figure stand. Like the rest of the figures in 1989, Rodan has the Destroy All Monsters tag, despite being the 1956 design, which obviously does not correspond to the movie. I believe the only point of articulation on Rodan is his head. The original price of this figure was about 1,200 yen, which is $8.28 in 89, whereas now he would cost you about $20. To be honest, I'm not a huge fan of this figure. It's just outdated and unfortunately outclassed, but it's serviceable and another nostalgia-powered vintage Bandai sculpt. I found this pretty cool image of a prototype shot of this figure. I don't think it's the original though, since it looks like it's the 1992 release, as it's next to the 68 Anguirus, which is up next, 92 Godzilla, and Mothra Larva sculpts. Forgive me that I don't have a ton of information on some of these later 89 figures, because simply the original 5 have so much to say, while these ones definitely just don't have as much information on them. Now, to round out the Destroy All Monsters figures from this year that actually appear in said movie, here we have Anguirus. This figure is pretty sick, one of the best sculpts yet in this line so far. This sculpt would later be used to be scaled down in the Godzilla Island series, the movie Monster series, the Toho Kaiju series, and the 50th anniversary memorial box. But this 8-inch scale figure is really cool. It has some great details and has all the desired features for an Anguirus sculpt. One cool thing is that because Anguirus is always crawling, his eyes are painted to basically always be looking up. Speaking of his paint, the original 89 release has 2 different shades of gold used, one used for the shell and tail, and the other for all of the other claws and spikes, and also for these cute highlights on the back of the legs, which is the main difference between this one and the 1992 reissue. This is definitely one of my favorites so far, such an iconic sculpt and one that'll be hard to beat. I will say that the sculpt isn't entirely accurate, the proportions are a bit cartoonish, and some minor things like the crest spikes not being as separated, but it doesn't really bother me in the same way that something like the original Gigan does. The slightly off proportions are just going to be a staple of these original vintage figures. Anzilla has articulation at his arms, legs. The original price of Anguirus was also 1,200 yen, which was again $8.28 in '89, whereas now he would cost you about $20. This is one of the most iconic Bandai Godzilla sculpts and is still touted as one of the best and fan favorite figures in the line. Not a whole lot of particular history to say other than this is another figure that had reissues in 1992 but had the code for 89 on the back of the tag. Now time for probably my least favorite figure of the entire line, Gigan. If you've known my channel for a decent amount of time, you probably know that I love Gigan. He's one of my favorite kaiju besides Godzilla himself, right up there with Baragon. But this figure, all I have to say is, no. I mean, everything is just off about this figure. The proportions, the shapes, the skinny frame, the posture, and the paint job. To be fair, the paint job, okay, isn't really offensive. It's just odd that the main body color is black instead of dark green. All the cybernetic parts are painted silver, and there's even a silver spray going down the back. And speaking of the back, where's his middle sail? Yeah, so the vintage Gigan is missing the center wing, or sail, whatever you want to call it, which is super weird. It's not like this figure was made under the same circumstances as the original 1984 Godzilla. Godzilla vs. Gigan came out an entire 17 years before this figure was first released, and they definitely knew what Gigan looked like. It's not even like the original Bullmark or even Popey figures followed this trend either. What an oddity. Back to the paint job, the actual paint itself is pretty clean, which is nice. The vibrant red orangey visor looks good, and the gold scales are painted quite well. I will give it some credit, the detail is really nice, and I like the differences in texture between the skin that's between the scales and the normal body texture. The arms and legs have swivels, while the tail has a glue seal. Gigan stands at around 8 inches tall, and since this figure was released in 1989, he also has a dam tag despite not appearing in that film. Gigan was also 1,200 yen at release, and I'm sure you've heard the price enough times for me to not cover it again. Overall, I really don't love this figure. It's weird and gross, and he's not my Gigan. This is the only figure where that classic vintage charm just doesn't work for me. This guy is a certified loser. Oh hey look, those are some other figures from this video.
Hey guys, it's an action figure of Megalon here. You know, from the 1973 film Godzilla vs. Megalon.
Now for the last figure we're going to go over in this video is Megalon. Quite the iconic figure.
Hey guys, you got invitations too, huh?
Megalon! I haven't seen you in years. Where have you been?
On eBay. Because this toy cost $80 fucking.
I also own this figure, although without tag and in pretty poor condition. Although Megalon nowadays can be seen as quite popular, when this figure was first released, it was seen as Bandai's first obscure monster, as there was the well-known Toho Big 5, along with the well-known fan favorites of the age like Gigan and Anguirus. During that time, there was much debate about who held that 8th spot, and I guess the release of this figure finally settled that for the time, so Megalon it was. Megalon himself is a pretty alright figure, but it definitely has aged poorly compared to some of these other vintage figures. But this is definitely a figure that the vintage nostalgia shines really brightly for. He stands at about 8.5 inches tall and doesn't really have a ton of paint. The figure is molded in a dark green, almost black vinyl, and paint-wise, it's mostly just the silver for the drills and a light silver spray for the horn and mouth. Megalon's eyes are a nice gold color alongside a darker hue for the chest and neck area. The cover for his wings on the back are also painted pretty nicely with a lighter gold. The biggest issue personally I have with this sculpt is the pose. It's extremely static for a monster that has so much personality. The proportions are also slightly off, with his head just being slightly too large and the antenna being really small and stubby, but that's obviously a limitation of small parts in Sofubi manufacturing at the time. The sculpt and detail overall are nice though. Megalon has articulation at the arms, head, and his big ol' cylindrical legs. Megalon, just like all the other figures released during this year, oddly has the damn tag. I should definitely mention that this guy does have a bootleg, famously covered by Fresh Vinyl Reviews, otherwise known as Rich Eso.
This was made in China. Made in China. Made in Japan. Made in Japan. Made in China. No year or Bandai on it. And bad paint job, cause it's a bootleg!
Which I believe is labeled on the foot saying that it's made in China. I think the bootleg is based on the Memorial Box release, but there may be one that mimics both. The main way to tell the difference between the bootleg and the official Bandai one is the bright gold eyes. The bootlegs are blacked out. Again, I think that at this point the bootlegs for these vintage figures are rarer than the official release, so I wouldn't be too worried about running into them. This is another figure that initially costed 1,200 yen at release. In general, this figure is solid overall, but definitely a product of its time, and there's nothing really wrong with that. This figure is super nostalgic and he's awesome, a figure that up until very recently, and by very recently I mean about 5 years ago, everyone wanted.
Because this toy cost $80 fucking dollars.
Because for the longest time, this and the YMSF were the only available Megalon figures at the more standard scale. Another awesome vintage release. So, that's it for the 80s. Sorry I didn't have a ton to say in terms of the history of the last few figures here. They just don't have as much rich history as the original 5 in the Great Monster series. Overall, Bandai's catalog in the 80s was truly amazing because by the tail end we got some awesome picks like Gigan, Megalon, Anguirus, and even Minya. And of course, I love the original 5 of 62, 64, 84, Mechagodzilla, and King Ghidorah. One day I wish to have all 5, but I'll leave that up for future me to deal with. Obviously, these aren't the greatest figures in the world, but they're not just a piece of Godzilla collecting history, but Godzilla history as a whole. And that's because, like it or not, merchandise has always been an integral part of the Godzilla revenue stream. And without properties like Godzilla and Ultraman, who knows where Bandai would even be today with how influential it is in the action figure and collecting space. So I'll always have an immense appreciation for this first group of figures from Bandai. I really enjoyed researching these original figures. It took a long ass time, obviously. Thank you guys so much for 1,000 subscribers. It really means a lot to me considering how hit or miss the quality of my content has been recently and considering how long I've been doing this for. And next time we'll be covering the 90s. Oh my lord.